Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to our workshop on Protecting Black Girlhood, how NCNW can respond to the Cradle to Prison pipeline. I'm Ariana Brazier. I go by Ari, and my pronouns are she and her. So if you are not using my name, but you are referring to me, you can use she and her. Those identify the gender that I align with. Currently, I am a national executive committee member at large. I'm the president of the Rankin-Mon Valley Pittsburgh section in Pennsylvania. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Pittsburgh. My research is with and about Black children living in poverty in the ways they play. And today I'm also representing the nonprofit that I founded and I lead, which is ATL Parent Like a Boss, Inc. And I'll give you a little bit more information about what we do and why we are presenting what we're presenting today after my mom introduces herself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ari. Yes, I'm Julie Brazier, and I'm currently a mentor for the Auburn University Family Child Care Partnerships program, serving licensed family child care providers in the Birmingham area. So I'm also, in addition to that, I am the mom of 4 joyful, beautiful Black children, one of whom, if you didn't catch that from the beginning, is Ariana. And I also serve as the chairwoman for the same organization, ATL Parent Like a Boss. And we are representing Parent Lab. We call it Parent Lab for short here today. So I am really thrilled to be here, and thank you all for joining us.
My mom has been an honorary member of NCNW for the last 8 years. Wait, how old am I? Yeah, last approximately 8 years, which includes coming to our meetings and presenting at workshops and facilitating bonding activities while I was at Spelman, and even into now when I live in Pittsburgh, she's participated and supported our work. So briefly, just about Parent Lab, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to enhance generational literacies through play and underserved Black communities. So basically what that means is historically, Black people have had millions of ways of making sense of what's happening in the world and around them. They have millions of ways of reading their environment. And so much of that is learned through play and physical movement, whether that be through dance, jump rope, running, sports, all of these different ways in which we use our body to learn and communicate. And what we're doing in Parent Lab is we're documenting those different ways, and we're using them to further an anti-racist, community-based agenda that elevates not only the play practices of Black communities, but also the learning practices and the legacies that are stored within our bodies and our communities. So today we're here presenting about Black children, but a specific subsect, Black girls. This session, just briefly, will provide an overview of key terms and institutional policies that undergird the Cradle to Prison pipeline. So the first half of the presentation is real content heavy in that we're trying to build a common language for which we can all access an understanding of what's happening to Black children, specifically Black girls in our United States educational system. So we'll have like a movement activity to get us started, and then we will move through a series of questions, and we have plenty of slides and graphics to talk about not only like statistically what the Cradle to Prison pipeline looks like, but also to ensure that we are using a language and a listening framework that helps us ensure that we're including all children, particularly Black girls, in our organizing practices and in our section-based programming. So just a few, you gonna say something, Mom?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was gonna. Were you about to start the activity or
no?
Okay, but anyway, let me interject, y'all. This is and get used to this is how we operate. But I do want to draw everybody's attention to the chat because of the time constraints and so forth. We really prefer to be more interactive, but since we do have time constraints, we are hoping that you will also type your thoughts and comments in the chat. We'd like to save them at the end because this informs future workshops and future work. So just feel free to add that in there. When we have a chance, we will try to respond. But I just want to make sure you're aware of that so you can start using it even now. Thanks, Ari. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. So I was just going to provide a quick few notes. When we use the term Black girlhood, we are striving to be intentionally inclusive of all Black girls, especially those who identify as LGBTQIA. So that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersect, or asexual, and or people who do not identify on the gender binary at all. So they do not identify as male or woman, or specifically, we're also working to address and highlight and lift up Black girls who do not conform to middle class norms. So you will see us talk a lot about like class and respectability, and that's because so many of the children who are confined to this pipeline are being criminalized for their deviation from middle class norms. So again, just briefly, the objectives of this workshop is one, to create a framework for understanding, to exchange and learn and build a common language for identifying what's happening to our Black girls. And two, kind of begin a practice of restorative justice that is not only beneficial to our work around Black girlhood, but also beneficial to ourselves as Black women and better ways of treating ourselves in order to release that compassion into our communities. So now we would do our movement activity. Okay, so I've stopped sharing the screen, and if you have the capacity, we ask that you turn your camera on. And this activity is called Stand Up If. So basically what's gonna happen is I'm going to read a prompt. And if you identify with this prompt, then you will stand up, okay? If you do not identify with this prompt, it has not been your experience, then you stay seated, okay? So that's the preferable method. If you're able to get up, we wanna get some movement in our bodies. So if I read a prompt and you identify with it, then you will stand up. If you do not, you'll stay seated. As a modification, if you do not have the capacity to stand, if for whatever reason, you are not able to stand, then we ask you hold 10 fingers up in the camera. And if you identify with the statement, then you will put a finger down. Okay, so we'll start with something real simple.
An interruption again, Ari.
Yes, Mom.
And just to add emphasis, of course it is up to you, but the reason for asking to turn your cameras on is because we want to be able to just like look across the screen and kind of identify commonalities, see the experiences that different folks have had or not had. So we just kind of get an idea. It's a little bit of community building as well. And when we're finished with this activity, you can turn your camera back off if you prefer.
Right. This is also an opportunity to look at each other. We've not really been able to see each other in the convention so far. So yes, please take advantage of that. Scroll through, say, hey, sister, do whatever you got to do. Okay, so we're going to get started. Stand up if you are a member of NCNW. Okay, so you're going to look around your screen, notice some people who are also members, and we're going to sit back down.
I don't see nobody.
Well, it should be in gallery
I don't
view.
either.
I didn't see nobody.
Okay, well,
I just see me.
It doesn't give us the option to go to gallery view.
Yes, please use gallery view, which is a little grid in the top right corner. It looks like maybe 4 boxes. You should be able to click on that grid and you should be able to see a number of faces in the little boxes.
And it's
Yeah,
where?
we don't have that option.
If you do not have the gallery option, then we'll just kind of share out some people we see standing, and we'll ask that you use the chat. So if you're not able to see people, go ahead and put in the chat like, hey, that was me too, or, oh, who else has had this experience? Okay, so if you're not able to see people, feel free to use the chat. Okay, so the first official prompt. Stand up if you were ever identified as a student who talks too much. So stand up or put a finger down if you are ever identified as a student who talks too much. Okay, so we're going to look around. We're going to scroll through the screen. We're going to just kind of note who we see. All right, and you sit down, back down. Again, feel free to use the chat. You could put like a yes or a Y if that was you.
Spotlighting people, Ari?
Hmm?
Are you spotlighting people?
No.
No.
Stand up if you attended school with the police and or resource officers stationed at or within your school. So stand up or put a finger down if you attended a school that had police officers or resource officers within your school. Okay, you can sit back down. Stand up if you have ever had to account for your bodily safety on your routes to and from school. Stand up if, or put a finger down if, you ever had to account for your bodily safety, if you ever had to think about how you would get to and from school safely at any point in your education. Okay, let's sit back down. Thank you. I'm scrolling though, so I am seeing that there are some people who are sharing these experiences. Stand up or put a finger down if you had less than 3 Black teachers in your K through 12 education. So stand up if you had less than 3 Black teachers in your K through 12 education. Okay, I see some people in the chat. Okay, we're gonna sit back down. Okay. Stand up if you were ever labeled loud, sassy, aggressive, or confrontational at any point in your education.
Yep.
We see some fingers down. Yep. Okay. So stand up if you were ever labeled sassy, loud, aggressive, or confrontational at any point in your education. Okay. All right, I see people standing. I see some fingers down. Okay. I thank you all for your honesty. Okay, go ahead and sit back down. Stand up if you were ever chastised or punished. This is within school or home or in your community for acting too grown. So if you were ever chastised or punished for acting too grown. Okay, I see some people standing. All right, see fingers down. Okay, we're gonna sit back down. Thank you. Okay, just a few more. Stand up or put a finger down if you were disallowed the opportunity to speak for yourself when you were the topic or the target. Stand up or put a finger down if you have ever been disallowed the opportunity to speak for yourself when you were the topic or the target. Okay. That's been my experience too, so let me stand up. Okay. Thank you. Stand up or put a finger down if you were ever kept from recess, PE, or playtime as punishment. Stand up or put a finger down if you were ever kept from recess, PE, or playtime as punishment. Okay, we see fingers down. Thank you. Okay, and then last 2. Stand up or put a finger down if you have ever challenged authority. This is at any point in your life. If you have ever challenged authority. Okay, we see almost everybody standing up. I see people in the chat agreeing. Yes, thank you, thank you. I love to see it, love to see it. Okay, and we sit back down. And then the last one. Stand up if you have ever been labeled ghetto, ratchet, flamboyant, or defiant. Stand up or put a finger down if you have ever been labeled as ghetto, ratchet, flamboyant, or defiant. Okay, thank you. And thank you all for your honesty. I'm gonna share my screen again. So basically, this is just kind of like a warm-up exercise that we wanted to do so that people can see the experiences that we share across our membership and people here, and the experiences that are then transferred and shared across the experiences Black girls are having right now in schools. Most of these prompts were taken directly out of the book Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in School. And these are many of the experiences that the author Monique Morris speaks to throughout the book. These are the experiences the Black girls she works with speak to throughout the book as reasons or prompts for the criminalization that they experience within their education system. So often, certain behaviors will lead to labels that then lead to policing, or certain labels then lead to behaviors that then lead to policing. And based off of what we just saw here, with so many people standing and agreeing, particularly in the parts about challenging authority and being labeled certain names and certain identities, this is often where we see the cradle to prison pipeline come in to being, is when Black girls are being unfairly labeled and when they are being unfairly discussed without an opportunity to speak for themselves. Okay, so we're just gonna get started with some basic terms. And some of these terms will even identify what we just spoke to. So if you see that happening, please put it in the chat, like, oh, you're speaking intersectionality, that prompt, this experience. So we'll also be asking questions again to kind of prompt dialogue throughout our presentation. Okay, go ahead, Mom.
All right, and I just want to say that we don't want to assume any level of knowledge or information on any of these terms. We made this an entry into the session so that we could begin a conversation with a common understanding of terms, because sometimes your understanding or your definition might be different than the one that we're using in this conversation. So that was our reason for introducing this kind of primer on these terms. And the first one, and I know we've heard this many times, is intersectionality. And a quote, "The violence that many women experience is often shaped by other dimensions of their identity, such as race and class. Moreover, ignoring difference within groups contributes to tension among groups. And so when the practices expound identity as woman or person of color as either or proposition, as an either or proposition, they relegate the identity of women of color to a location that resists telling." And from Audre Lorde, we have this quote that says, "There are not single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives." Intersectionality speaks to the ways in which there is no hierarchy of identity or oppression. We can be experiencing multiple oppressions that intersect differently at once from moment to moment. There's one term that's emblematic of intersectionality, and that is misogynoir, which identifies the specific form of anti-Black misogyny experienced by Black women and girls.
Okay, so the next term we have here is play deprivation. This is one that we use frequently in Parent Lab, and I do believe is an example of intersectionality, particularly intersecting oppressions. And it is play deprivation. Play deprivation is a spectrum from extreme to moderate reduction in opportunities to play, which negatively affects children's social, cognitive, and physical development. So you'll notice here that we're using this thread of play to talk about Black girl magic and to talk about the cradle to prison pipeline. In low-income communities, Black children are disproportionately subjected to play deprivation, and they are denied their legal right to playtime. The children's right to play is enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And so when children are subjected to play deprivation, which is a situation in which they are kept from play or play is withheld from them, then they're being denied their right to not only play, but to healthy, equitable, holistic, physiological, socio-emotional development. So it's important that we have a distinction here between play deprivation and a play deficit. As adults, most of us are running on play deficits, and that simply means that we are just not getting enough playtime in our day-to-day experiences. And for children who are entrapped in a system in which they have very little control, if any, agency at all, they're having playtime withheld from them, often as a form of punishment, which then is depriving them of the necessary benefits that play offers to our physical development. So at this time, we're also going to ask that you think about and share in the chat what have been some of your favorite games throughout your life. And if you've had any experiences in which those games were taken from you or you were not allowed to enjoy them. One experience that I often share is I was in middle school and I went to a predominantly white Catholic school, and I got sent back, myself and the other 2 Black girls in my class got sent back to the classroom because we laughed too much during PE. So we were disallowed the opportunity to participate in PE, which this day happened to be a dance class, and we were leading the dance class. And we were told that we were too loud and we laughed too much and that our laughter was obnoxious, and we were sent back to the classroom. So that is not only an example of play deprivation, but it's also an example of an intersecting oppression, right? We're not really, you can't really know, was that a race situation, a gender situation, was it both, was a misogynoir, right? This is an example of how intersectionality acts on Black girls.
Yes, indeed. The next term we have is adultification. And it's a process of socialization in which children function at a more mature developmental stage because of situational context and necessity, especially in low resource community environments. Also, a social or cultural stereotype that is based on how adults perceive children in the absence of knowledge of children's behavior and verbalizations. This latter form of adultification is based in part on race. And I'm an early childhood educator, and so we use that term developmentally appropriate practice all the time, and just having that understanding of where kids should be at certain age levels. And this is what this quote is pointing to. Black girls experience a specific type of age compression where they're seen as more adult-like than their white peers. People perceive Black girls to need less nurturing, less protection, to know more about sex, and to be more independent than their white peers. They're experiencing harmful stereotypes attached to Black womanhood at the same time they're experiencing the constraints and challenges of childhood. And I would say, anecdotally, as a Black mother, we kind of feel the opposite. We're protecting our girls more than a lot of these white children we see out there. But then, in society, our girls are being perceived as older and being taken out of childhood too soon.
Yes, I would say that this term is gaining like increasing popularity, as it should, because we see it too often, like, oh, she's acting too grown, right? Or they were dressed too grown, as if that's cause for some sort of mistreatment of our Black girls. But we see that statistically, adultification, or as Monique Morris calls it, age compression, begins at about 5 years old for Black girls, whereas for Black boys, it begins about 10 years old. So as early as 4 or 5 years old, Black girls are already expected to conduct themselves in certain ways in which they could be held responsible as if they're adults, but then they are made to be infants and treated as though they have no say over themselves and their bodies, as if they're babies, right? So they're in this weird tension, this liminal state that is really harmful, not only to like their self-esteem, but also to like their human rights. So adultification factors into internalized oppression. Internalized racial oppression is the process by which Black people, this term comes specifically out of the book Push Out, which is about Black girls. But I would argue that internalized racial oppression exists across the racial spectrum. It is a process by which Black people internalize and accept, not always consciously, the dominant white culture's oppressive actions and beliefs towards Black people. Examples given might be negative stereotypes, discrimination, hatred, falsification of historical facts, racist doctrines, and white supremacist ideology, while at the same time rejecting the African worldview and cultural motifs. For Black women and girls, internalized racial oppression is also gendered. So at the same time that like Black women, we ourselves and Black girls are experiencing the violence of white supremacy itself, right, or racism, we're also experiencing our own internalized racism. We've internalized and we've swallowed the messages about ourselves, about our communities, about our bodies as women and as Black people.
Yes, and the cool thing is the way that one definition kind of feeds into the other. And so definitely internalized racist oppression and inferiority feeds into this respectability politics, which is the next term. And Professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who coined the term politics of respectability, She wrote that Black women felt respectable behavior earned esteem from white America and strove to win the Black lower classes' psychological allegiance to temperance, industriousness, thrift, refined manners, and Victorian sexual mores. Be good Christians, dress modestly, don't drink, be frugal, keep clean, be chaste, work hard. Conservative morality was the blueprint for Black integration. Historically, respectability was a way to survive the racial terrorism of the US. Excuse me. The Black elite promoted respectability to prove that Black people, that we were good citizens and undeserving of brutality. Now, today, though, Black girls are forced to navigate polarizing categories. I saw a little bit of this in the chat leading to this. They're either good girls or ghetto girls who behave in ways to embody negative stereotypes about Black people, especially Black women, and socioeconomic class. Frequently, they're deemed ghetto and subject to criminalizing responses when they deviate from social norms that are tied to narrow white middle class definitions of femininity. And again, that's from Monique Morris. In her book, Monique Morris reframes our reading. She reframes it now of Ghetto Black Girls with the following quote. For Black girls, to be ghetto represents a certain resilience to how poverty has shaped racial and gendered oppression. To be loud is to demand to be heard. To have an attitude is to reject a doctrine of invisibility and mistreatment. To be flamboyant or fabulous is to revise the idea that socioeconomic isolation is equated with not having access to materially desirable goods and things. To be ghetto, a Black girl, then, is to reinvent what it means to be Black, female, and poor. And I just want to add in here, we've referred to Monique Morris's book a few times. So just to shout her out and to point out that a lot of our inspiration came from her book, and a lot of our understanding, mine especially, comes from what she's written and the work she's done with young girls.
Yeah, and so I think that quote is important because not only is she showing a way in which she's giving these Black girls, she's allowing a certain sense of grace in these encounters she's having with Black girls who have historically been labeled defiant, aggressive, confrontational. Many of the interviews she does in her book are actually being done in like alternative schooling settings. But I think she provides a good model or framework, a way of thinking for us, right? So often we're quick to jump and say like, this child is being defiant on purpose. This child is creating an opposition or is challenging authority, but we don't ask why. We don't ask why, and we're not often, we're not taught really to investigate the reasons for this child's behavior or the reasons that this child might be having some sort of response. We're not taught how to respond to trauma and stress triggers. And so I do think that in many ways, particularly in this quote, particularly about respectability, Monique Morris is challenging us to dig a little further when we are in relationship with Black girls. So this term here, unarchived forms of discipline, is particularly interesting to me because this is the only essay I've ever come across it in, and it's written by Connie Woon. And basically she says that unarchived forms of discipline are examples are when girls are sent out of class for the entire period, they're yelled at or they're embarrassed in front of class, or they're left feeling constantly scrutinized. Historically, these informal types of punishment have not been documented as forms of discipline within school discipline literature. So these don't often show up in like the form of a write-up. Instead, there have been greater emphasis on suspensions and expulsions. So these are much harder to document. These are much harder to create like statistical data for these examples in which Black girls are humiliated or they're pushed out of the classroom. However, these unarchived forms of discipline are commonly practiced, if not more so than suspensions and expulsions. They also serve to constrain and punish the girls' movements and behaviors. So if you think to an example, many of us stood up when we said we were labeled a name, or many of us stood up when we said we had playtime withheld from us. you can imagine how that begins to condition you to act a certain way or to fear the possibility of a certain response, right? So after I was sent back to class for laughing too loudly, I might never laugh again in PE, you know? And so it begins to condition Black girls into certain movements and behaviors that are actually more harmful to their freedom and their joy. But these things do not show up. These forms of discipline don't show up in like educational data because they're not being documented by the teacher and they're not being documented by Black girls. And often we're not even thinking to ask Black girls, what other kinds of punishment are you experiencing in your classroom? What other ways have you been made to feel as though you're not important here?
I'm reading the chat and getting riled up and dropping my notes here. So back to Monique Morris again, and the term push out here. So we get to define it. And push out refers to punitive discipline practices schools use, which secludes students from class and too often push them out of school altogether. These practices affect all students, but they disproportionately affect students of color, students with disabilities, and LGBTQIA students. School policies that are innately biased make it difficult not only for girls of color to thrive in school, but even to merely survive in such a setting. Zero tolerance policies criminalize Black and brown girls as they are being expelled or suspended for minor infractions. Pushout is the result of school policies, administrative practices, and our nation's institutionalizing culture that effectively forces students out of school or leaves them with an unbearable struggle to survive within their school settings.
So this is about where we kind of transition for a moment, and we're going to go through the different iterations of the school to prison pipeline. So you have some of the basic factors that play into the school to prison pipeline, right? We have respectability, internalized oppression. We didn't define racism here, I think for obvious reasons. You know, we have these different terms that then factor into the school to prison pipeline, but there are many ways of entering and understanding and experiencing the school to prison pipeline. So just broadly, here is a definition provided by Miriam Kaba and Erica Miners. Both are abolitionists and grassroots organizers and scholars in the field working in the prison industrial complex. And they say that the school to prison pipeline is actually less of a pipeline than a nexus or a swamp. The school to prison pipeline is generally used to refer to interlocking sets of structural and individual relationships in which youth, primarily of color, are funneled from schools and neighborhoods into under or unemployment and prisons. Often the term is used to describe the differentials between white and Black suspension and arrest as disproportionality. But this term, disproportionality, masks the central roles white supremacy and anti-Black racism play in shaping ideas and practices surrounding school discipline. So some examples that are offered as, I'd say, triggers in the school to prison pipeline are zero tolerance policies, resource officers or police officers in schools, metal detectors, being educated in an under-resourced school, a deficit of school counselors, a lack of cultural competency, unmotivated and unsupported staff that does not reflect the student body, be that in race, gender, disabilities, remedial and or advanced placement tracking. This is a big one for me. Again, I went to a private school, but I was often the only Black student in my advanced placement classes. And I should not have been the only Black student in my advanced placement classes, but I was. And so when you think about how tracking and labels work, it begins at a very young age. Also, Monique Morris, actually, she doesn't use the language of the school to prison pipeline. When she's talking about Black girls, she actually uses the phrase school to confinement pathway. And that's because the school to prison pipeline operates in a very gendered way. And for Black girls, they're often not pushed into prisons so much as they are into other carceral spaces. So other spaces that operate like prisons, but are not federally labeled prisons, such as they're put on house arrest, they're given ankle monitors, they're put in detention facilities or group homes. In many cases, they're removed from their actual home. So again, Monique Morris, when she's referring to Black girls, she uses the phrase school to confinement pathway.
All right, and then we take it even a step deeper, and a term that we really like to use is the cradle to prison pipeline, because it doesn't start when they enter school. The cradle to prison pipeline, as Marian Wright Edelman defines it, is it consists of a complex array of social and economic factors, as well as political choices that converge to reduce the odds that poor children, especially poor Black and Latino children, will grow up to become productive adults. And then another reason we choose to use the cradle to prison pipeline in our title is to acknowledge that, like I mentioned before, the school to prison pipeline begins incarcerating families before a child is even born due to the ongoing conditions of surveillance and criminalization that already exist for Black parents in their communities, that the parents are already being subjected to before the children are even born. So with this in mind, our presentation takes things at kind of like an age and grade specific analysis, beginning with early child care instead of elementary school.
Okay, so another way in which the school to prison pipeline is referred to is the educational survival complex. And I'm going to take a slightly different approach, Mom. I'm going to start talking through more of these because I want to make sure that we're able to get through the presentation as a whole. We've been reading them because we do have a prepared script, but due to time constraints, I want to make sure we get through everything. So Bettina Love talks about the educational survival complex in her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. And she basically is talking about how our educational system is like this broad, all-consuming complex that is only teaching Black children how to survive racism. So from class to class, grade to grade, Black children are being subjected to what she calls spirit murdering. In many ways, they're seeing violence on TV and then it's reenacted in their classrooms. They're not being taught about themselves. They're not being taught to love themselves in these spaces. All they're being taught to do is to be quiet and how to move on to the next grade. And she says that just mirrors the experience that they then have in the rest of the world beyond education. And so this really speaks to the ways in which our educational complex that she talks about is rooted in a white supremacist culture, one in which Black contributions to history are not valued, and Black self-love is not taught or facilitated or even centered in our classrooms. She talks extensively in her research about how if you do not love a Black child, you cannot teach a Black child. And this is what we're seeing in our educational survival complex. It's much less about the education than it is about preparing children for life inside of a racist system.
Okay, so the next one is the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And y'all, of course, we understand that they're not separate pipelines, that these are all feeding into the larger prison pipeline. And in the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, we have young girls being arrested for being sex workers and, you know, prostitution charges and so forth. And then they're punished as adults rather than being punished as victims and as survivors of this trauma. And then once they get put into these juvenile justice situations, then those spaces are not equipped to deal with the trauma that these young girls have experienced. And they also often are re-traumatized for what they've been through, and additionally traumatized while they're in there from new incidences. So then this is exponentially compounding what's already, you know, what they've already come in there with. Not to mention that the education system within those institutions is not matching what they ought to be getting on the outside.
Okay, so also thinking about solutions. So we have cradle to prison pipeline, the educational survival complex, the school to confinement pathway, the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, right? All of these terms are defining the same complex, the same similar experiences within the educational system. So we have a basic framework for identifying these oppressions. We also want to have some basic terms for identifying our solutions. And the first one we're sharing is culturally sustaining pedagogy. And basically, culturally sustaining pedagogy is operating from the belief that like Black children, really children of all races, all cultures, all experiences, but for the context of this presentation, Black children are already coming into school with all kinds of assets. Their community is an asset, their culture is an asset, their music, their hair, their life, their skin is an asset. How do we build an educational experience around that strength, right? So it's not so much about like making sure that Black people are represented in the curriculum so much as it is making sure that we are sustaining the life and the joy of these Black children from start to finish, and that they are the center of our curriculum. So it's about sustaining not only this child, but sustaining the culture from which this child comes.
Yes, the next term is restorative justice. And the current system is asking the questions: what law was broken? Who broke it? What punishment is warranted? But restorative justice is taking a completely different route. They're asking who was harmed and what caused this harm, and what can we do to strengthen and rebuild maybe the relationships between the individuals that have all been affected, because it might not be more, it might not be just the two that we see and the two that get punished. In our westernized sense, though, restorative justice is looked upon as a tool to come in after the fact. But in the indigenous communities where this practice originated, it's not some tool you bring in later. It is a way of life. It's a way of living and resolving conflict and working together in community from the get. So it's not something we think of afterward. When we're using restorative justice and transformative justice, we're looking at the needs of those affected and the context. This is why I have to use this phrase: the context that produced or shaped the harm. We must take that into account. And then we're trying to transform or build or rebuild what was lost. Instead of thinking of this punishment as a final resolution, we're going to send them off, to, I don't know, be fixed. So restorative justice as a discipline is something that we have to cultivate. And we're trying to pull folks in and call folks into the circle instead of pushing them out or just calling attention to them and pushing them out.
Okay, so the next term is one that hopefully all of us are well acquainted with, and that's Black Girl Magic. We didn't put a definition up here because it should look different for every person. And so what we're going to invite you to do is to go ahead and share in the chat what your definition of Black Girl Magic is. And maybe if you want to take it a step further, even think about why our definition is a solution to some of these challenges and the oppressions that we've identified. So again, what is your definition of Black Girl Magic? Why is that solution oriented? And if you have an example, who is your example of Black Girl Magic? Just briefly, mine is my mom.
You cheated. I was going to say that you were mine.
Beat you.
Yeah, I know. While y'all are typing that, and we're looking, I am so enjoying what I'm learning so much just reading the chat. Let's talk about Black Girl Ways of Knowing, which to me is a part of Black Girl Magic. It's this experiential knowledge. And as in our notes, even we're referring to girls and everything, but I keep wanting to say we and us because it goes beyond age. And I am going to just read a little bit of what we have here, like going beyond the categories of age. It's a feeling or an affective relationship to the self. It's rediscovering and celebrating ourselves for sure. Asserting that the Black Girl Ways of Knowing lead Black girls and women to a more collective freedom. And someone mentioned in here about the paradigms that we've been scripted into. And this is a means for dismantling those paradigms and the misogyny, and that's keeping us bound into this invisible slavery and the toxic respectability of us trying to please this other that's watching us. Of course, we know Black girls have multiple ways of reading, of knowing, not reading. We read verbal cues, nonverbal cues, body language is big, code switching across all kinds of contexts. And all of these are ways that Black girls respond, challenge, create, shape, imagine. So this workshop and our organization, we should be attentive to these ways and explore it much more, the expression of that knowledge. And I want to say explore and allow much more the expression of that knowledge as well.
Right. And by organization, NCNW. As an organization, NCNW, we should be attentive to the myriad ways that Black girls are expressing what they know and what they see and what they love and what they care about. And this quote comes from the essay, Twerk Something, Theorizing Black Girl Epistemology in the Body. And so Ariana Holiday is talking about the Black girl magic in twerking in this essay. So briefly, we kind of already shared this. And this quote here is from an essay about Black children at play. And we shared it here just to kind of, again, highlight the ways that Black children's play tells stories. It is inherently intergenerational. If you think of the hand clapping games you played as a child and you think about who taught you, there's probably an older child, a cousin, an auntie, right? When you think about jump roping chants, there's probably an older cousin, a neighbor, an auntie, right? Like Black children, when they're playing, they're telling stories, they're teaching, and they're transferring legacy from person to person, generation to generation through the capacities of our body, right? So much of what we know is because we carry it in our bodies. And when we dance, when we sing, when we move, when we play, we are exchanging that energy and that joy with another person. And so a lot of the work that Parent Lab is doing and the work that I hope that NCNW can expound upon is creating safer spaces for Black girls to be in their bodies and to have this language so that they can challenge the systems and they can push back on the authorities who do not seek to celebrate that agency in their bodies. Okay, so we're gonna kind of move through these fairly quickly, and we're gonna go through some of the ages and stages and just a few statistics. What you'll see on the screen in one slide are headlines. These are actual headlines from the last 10 years around like children at play, particularly Black children, not just girls. And then in the next slide, you'll see images of like what happens, the magic and the beauty that shines through when we allow and invite and create space for Black children at play, particularly Black girls. Okay, go ahead, Mom.
Yes, I do, Ari. I don't recall you mentioning, we have put together a resource handout as well that covers a lot of this. So if we weren't able to actually speak about it here, just by request, Ari?
I'll share it. I'm gonna share it. You're getting ahead. You're getting too ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. So yes, early childhood. And like we mentioned, the cradle to prison pipeline does start here. And just skimming over some of the statistics, like there are, in 2011-12, 6% of the schools that, the school districts that had children in preschool reported that 6% were suspending children out of school at least once. And then moving on.
Those are preschool children.
Yes, preschool.
So they're suspending preschool children.
Yes, like out of school suspension, not timeout. And then 18% of preschool enrollment was represented by Black children, but 48% were receiving more than one out of school suspensions, more than one. And then in 2013 and 14, the data shows that although Black girls were representing only 20% of the female preschool enrollment, but 54% of preschool children, of the preschool children who were suspended for out of school suspensions, just out of school, were Black girls, Black children. So this is where we're coming back to play being so important at this age. And there are some obvious ways that play is being deprived from children as they're, and
Mom, can I say something too? That last statistic you shared is another example of adultification. So if you recall that about 5 years old, right, Black girls begin being viewed as adults, like their behaviors is viewed as adults. And I just want to repeat that statistic one more time. While Black girls only represent 20% of female school enrollment, they represent 54% of children, broadly, just children being removed from their schools. So this is preschool, this is 5 and under.
Right. And that is the population that I serve the most. So we always come back to play. Play is largely one of the solutions that we advocate. So then, in addition to the obvious ways which play is being deprived of children, that these children we're talking about being dismissed, suspended. There are other barriers to play that are moving children into the pipeline. They're being excluded in early childhood, even toddlers, from group activities. Rewards are being withheld. Sadly, in a lot of our situations, the teachers are not trained well or equipped with good positive classroom management skills. Kids already are being labeled and tracked, um, and treated as behavior issues from they move from the toddler room to the preschool room at the daycare. Um, how is this affecting Black girls? Respectability plays here too, definitely at this age. And sadly, y'all, when some of the teachers, we're Black women, and we are tending to discipline our own children more harshly because we have these old school ways that we're following, how my mama disciplined me. And we're concerned about our children being like getting ahead and not being left behind because we know that there's a disadvantage already as they're coming in. So even though we have the best intention, it still has a negative effect because we're still seeing our children being put out as behavior problems.
So
And
also, oh, go ahead, Ma.
no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, so a key point here too about respectability is like how often we funnel not just Black girls, but girls in general in preschool settings or daycare settings to play with girl toys, right? Or to keep their hair neat or to keep their dresses neat, right? But the boys are allowed to play in the dirt and they're not expected to clean up the table and help wash dishes, right? Like these are other examples of like gender-based respectability that keep girls away from play and the freedom that we get to see boys having and experiencing at a very young age.
So what it looks like when when they're not deprived of play opportunities and when their self-expression is respected, they're getting the chance, and it's so fun to watch, to try out and experience the world from their own unique point of view and also to create it as they go along. They get to test out and navigate ways on their own, ways of resolving conflict and figuring out challenging things. They do this on their own and with their peers. So someone else's way isn't necessarily being imposed on them or someone else's rules.
So when you're when you're giving children the freedom to play, you're also teaching them about consent, right? Like what feels good in their bodies. And if it doesn't feel good in their bodies, then they're learning to say, no, that's not good for me.
Yes, yes, great point. And yes, and just beginning to know what our bodies are capable of on our own terms, trying things out, taking risks, and being able to do it with fewer inhibitions. That's exciting to me. Oh yes, I'm still talking, right? Elementary school.
Unless you want me to.
No, I got it. Much more of the same. Similar statistics. Um, Black girls, 16% of girls in elementary school, but more than twice as likely as white girls to be arrested. We're not talking suspended, arrested in the schools.
In elementary school.
Yes, we're still in elementary school, y'all. We haven't graduated up. Black girls, nearly 6 times more likely to receive one or more out of school suspensions and 3 times more likely to receive one or more in school suspensions and referrals to law enforcement. And then, of course, at this age, we're also starting to experience the fallout of these strictly enforced dress codes, exclusion from activities as punishment, like different moving the desk closer to the teacher or even out into the hallway, being sent to the principal. There aren't enough school social workers, and in elementary school, we're introduced to school resource officers. And Ari has some examples on the screen of some concrete examples of this with even now parents being reported to DSS when the kids don't report to Zoom school. And we have a child who was asked to leave from a Catholic school close to New Orleans because her braid extensions didn't meet the dress code. So these things are real and happening now, and of course we know it's not new as well. And so when I think about cooperative play, because we always go back to play as a solution. So in the elementary school, around 4 years old, actually into the teen years, kids are playing cooperatively. They are interested in each other and the activity. It is a shared interest, and they're all taking part in the rules and everything and the boundaries. This is happening at the same time as they're being introduced to the education system that is more institutionalized, that is more rule-based, institutionalized racism, I should say, that are more rule-based. And there's more punitive control measures. They're being watched more. They're having more access, restricted access to recess, to PE, to just time to just be without structure. And then in our under-resourced schools, they tend to be more, well, there's a reflection there that adults think that it's not safe for our poorer children to have unstructured time, even though research indicates the opposite. And then in an attempt to close up the gaps and the educational disparities, a lot of our creative arts time, PE, recess again, these things are being cut out of our school situation in order to close this intellectual gap per se. And again, this is contrary to what the research says, what our knowledge is, that we learn best when we're able to move our bodies. And movement, it enhances our brain's abilities. It stimulates the brain cells. And so it's at the same time as we're wanting our kids to learn more and do better, we're depriving them of the movement and the play that's going to help to reinforce the learning.
So middle school, what does the Cradle to Prison pipeline look like for middle schoolers? Among the nation's middle schoolers between 2013 and 2014, 15% of the girl student population was Black. So 15% of students were Black, 15% of female students were Black. However, Black girls were nearly 7 times more likely than white girls to receive 1 or more out of school suspensions. So that is 7 times more likely. Black girls were also nearly 5 times more likely to be arrested and 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement. So again, this is middle school. This is about what, ages 10 to 13, 14. And so here on the screen, again, we have a few more examples of situations in which like Black girls or Black children in middle school were literally murdered. They weren't just criminalized in some instances for being children. Tamir Rice playing with a toy gun, this 11-year-old grabbing an extra milk in the cafeteria. These 4 girls, the principal or the administrator thought that they were too giggly. And so they were subjected to this strip search. But like, what happens when we respect children's right to play, their freedom of expression, particularly Black girls? What does it look like? It looks like all of this Black girl magic you see on the screen. And we do not relegate Black girls to certain ideals of respectability, like certain games, certain hairstyles, like certain ways of being. They get to explore themselves and they get to explore solutions to the problems they're seeing all around themselves. At this age, Black girls, children in period, but specifically Black girls, they're coming into puberty and they're learning to cope with the changes that are occurring, not just in their bodies, but around them, right? You become much more aware of your environment. And play is just one medium through which children work through what they're seeing happening to themselves and to their communities. And so at this age, the social aspect of play is critical, but this is also the age where you stop having recess, you stop getting access to PE, right? And if adultification sets in at 5, at 13, for Black girls at 13, it can have lethal, it can have very lethal consequences. So again, when we support and we invest in Black girl play, Black girl magic, Black girl everything, right? We help create spaces and systems where Black girls can thrive, much like the ones you see here on the screen. Marley Diaz she's collecting 1,000 Black girl books in support of the Black Girl Doll Project. We have here another Black girl was both homecoming queen, and a football player, right? When we don't narrow or push them into certain confined ideals of girlhood, they get to expand themselves and they get to set whole new precedents for the rest of history to follow. So cradle to prison pipeline, high school. During 2013-2014, Black girls, despite only being 16% of female students in high school, were nearly 5 times more likely to receive 1 or more out-of-school suspensions and nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested than white students, white girl students in particular. I think we hear much more frequently about the narratives. We at least see the video footage. I don't suggest you see it, but we do see video footage of like high schoolers, particularly Black girl high schoolers, being manhandled by police and by administrators. That's not an experience we often see at 5 years old because 5-year-olds aren't often carrying around cell phones. And high school students are much more adept at articulating themselves than maybe younger children. So we do hear these narratives a bit more, but we're still not hearing them enough. And we're not learning to respect these experiences, and we're not learning to adjust them through a restorative framework. So again, the last question for this stage is like, what happens when you allow Black girls to express themselves? When you make space for that, you get all of these things you see on the screen. The 3 Black girls whose selfies you see on the screen, I work with here in Pittsburgh. And when we really learn to listen to Black girls, we see the ways they affirm each other and they create spaces to affirm themselves. In this case, these 3 girls launched a social media campaign about Black girlhood and self. What do you love about yourself? And they were able to do a daily affirmation project throughout quarantine. And so creating spaces for these Black girls and Black girls everywhere to do exactly that kind of work for themselves, you really begin to see just how expansive and how limitless our magic really is. So Mom, I hope you don't mind. We have about 10, 15 minutes left. I can run through the next few slides.
Sure, go ahead. I'm typing some answers in the chat, so that works perfect.
And then I will share the link to these resources. So the next few things you're seeing on the screen are actually some of the practices that we're suggesting that we adopt as a section, an organization, as individuals. I'm also putting in the chat a link to a Google Doc that I created alongside one of my fellow, I call her NCNW sister. She helped create this resource document I just shared in the chat that has links to not only the essays and books and things that were cited in this presentation, but the next few slides I'm gonna kind of run through. So now that we have a basic understanding for some of the oppressions and the systems, right, that are in place to keep Black girls in their place, we also want to think about like, what do we do? And we start with the self, okay? We don't start with this big expansive vision of a system. We start with ourselves. Where do we as an individual go from here? So some practices, so these are things that have to be disciplined into, right, that we have to cultivate within ourselves are listed here on the screen. We practice listening to Black children, especially Black girls. Many of us are probably thinking like, oh, I already do that. But if you already do that, how can you do it better? Practice the why framework. Adrienne Marie Brown talks extensively about how when we ask children, we ask people, but especially children, why, we then begin to realize that we might have acted the same exact way. We might have done the same exact thing, or we might be the problem, right? But so often we are scared to ask why because we don't want to be the problem. But when we do ask why, that's how we really get to solutions. We practice having difficult conversations. Brene Brown is a famous scholar on shame and stigma. And she says one of the most meaningful gifts you could ever give a child is the ability to have difficult conversations. And how do you do that? You teach them by practicing it. You model it. You ask why, and you open the door to difficult conversations. You practice strength-based approaches. How can we better give girls the benefit of the doubt? The benefit of the doubt. How can we better give ourselves the benefit of the doubt? We need to better practice asking parents what barriers to engagement they're experiencing. So instead of just assuming that parents aren't showing up for their kids or assuming that they have basic barriers like transportation, those sort of things that are easily addressed, how do we actually begin to ask them? What are the barriers you're facing? And where do we fill this gap? How do we fill this gap instead of assuming? Right, so there's so many assumptions operating around the family, but until we give parents the benefit of the doubt, we can't move forward because it's parents who start that visionary practice for children. As soon as they know that they're carrying a child, they begin thinking of that child's future. And when we cut parents out of this cradle to prison pipeline, we cut whole communities off, right? But it's the fallout of the cradle to prison pipeline is experienced community-wide. We practice advocating for structural changes in a culture of support for teachers and educators. Mariam Makaba, I think it was her, and Erica Meaners, they said that, remember that a teacher's working conditions are a student's learning conditions. So until teachers have better working conditions, students won't have better learning conditions. The two are inextricably connected. We need to practice imagining alternatives and creative strategizing and co-constructing safety. So often now it's really popular for us to walk into a space and everybody's like, oh, it's a safe space. But safety looks differently for everybody. So we need to do a better job of saying like, hey, how can you be better respected in this space? How can I respect your autonomy? What are your pronouns, right? Because we don't know what triggers and experiences people are bringing into a space. So it has to be co-constructed from the start. We need to all meet each other where we're at. And then finally, as an individual practice, we need to practice intergenerational rest and healing. We need to take time to care for ourselves. We need to take time to play, and we need to do more of what we love. As for the section, what can we do? This is just the first of 2 slides. And again, this is in the Google Doc that I shared. Hopefully you have access to it. As a section, we suggest that you begin contacting your local school board and you petition to end zero tolerance policies and school suspensions. That's work that I've been engaged with here in Pittsburgh, working to end out of school suspensions, and that is work that I am heavily committed to. For much longer conversation, a presentation maybe on its own, when we talk about the repercussions of out of school suspension, the list is long. It's very long. And so we could start by advocating on a school board level to end these zero tolerance policies and school suspensions. We can support and hold the board and school administrators accountable for ensuring that schools are not over referring to law enforcement, right? Nowadays, it's like many administrators and teachers already have police in the building. So it's nothing to call them into the classroom, but were there other interventions that could have taken place before it escalated to this point? And how do we ensure that our schools are being held accountable to those interventions? We need to train all of our section members in trauma-informed care. This would also then encourage local schools to train their educators in trauma-informed care. We should be advocating for culturally sustainable and developmentally appropriate pedagogy. Expecting 5-year-olds to sit in front of a computer screen for 8 hours a day is not developmentally appropriate. It's just not, it's harmful. And so we need to be better advocating for a more healthy educational experience for our children. They're not gonna learn if we're expecting them to do what adults do and what adults shouldn't even be expected to do. We could sponsor as a section a professional development workshop for a local early childcare program. I think often about the daycares my mom works with, childcare centers, apologies mom. The childcare centers that my mom works with, right? Children who are like newborns to 5 years old. And I think about how many of them are working from inside their homes, and they're already working on a budget because they're trying to make sure that these families have everything they need at all costs. So what can our sections sponsor for these childcare facilities? What weight can these sections take off of the shoulders of these earliest foundations of our education system? We could host a listening session with teachers to explore their needs. Again, instead of assuming, we just go directly to the source and we say like, hey, what do you need? And where do you see us fitting in this picture, right? This all has to be co-constructed. None of these things should be done in isolation. We can create intergenerational sister circles rooted in mutual aid. I'm wearing a Free Our Mothers t-shirt. This is from the National Bailout Project. Every year they do a Black Mother's Bailout, a Mother's Day bailout. If you look at the numbers of children of incarcerated parents who then enter this carceral system, it is harrowing, it's horrifying. And so if you can create circles of mutual aid, it will go a long way. Advocate for comprehensive sex education. This is critical in our quest for a holistic educational system that really does respect the bodies and the agency of Black girls. Speak to PTA and or parental leaders about school-based discipline policies. What visions do the teachers and the parents have for their children? It might not align with what's actually being enforced in the school. So how can you amplify the voices of the teachers who are already doing that work? Organize a section book club to educate the community. I have plenty of books and you all know where to find me. So if you ever need recommendations, you can start with that Google Doc and then you can hit me up. We could collaborate with students to create a personal and community-wide asset map. Again, this goes back to that listening practice. Ask your girls, ask your children, What in your community is most important to you? How can we preserve that? How can we celebrate it? What should we be doing to document its role in your life? And we could be petitioning schools to implement restorative justice practices. And when we say restorative justice, we mean the indigenous, daily, cultural practice of restoration. We don't just mean the space that these schools are creating to send children and put them in isolation, because now restorative justice is being warped. And we really want to get to the root in the historical framework for restorative justice. And then finally, we want to petition school boards to invest in counselors, social workers, restorative justice coordinators, community intervention workers, and other supportive school staff. If anything, we should be doing the preventative work, not the reactionary work. And it starts with our school counselors. It starts with the people who are trained and already passionate about doing this work in their communities. And then just briefly, also in the Google Doc, we put these lists of organizations to support. In that Google Doc, there are the mission statements and links to the different organizations. I'll just shout a few out. Justice for Black Girls is doing phenomenal work training Black girls in these exact language. They have this Black Girl Ambassador program where they're teaching girls to identify the systems that oppress, and they're preparing them and equipping them with that language. Then they're going into college classrooms. These are high school students and middle school students going into college classrooms and corporate spaces to teach about their experiences. The Abolitionist Teacher Network is run by Bettina Love and other scholars who are working within that similar Black Lives Matter framework for educators. The Children's Defense Fund, hopefully we're all aware of the great legacy of Marian Wright Edelman. Girl Check, when we talk about creating a practice of intergenerational rest and healing, Girl Check is an amazing organization to support and get behind and get out and walk with and pray with and learn from. And Black Visions Collective, you've seen some of the phenomenal work they've been doing in Minneapolis, and particularly around like bailout and grassroots community-based organizing. And so these are just some examples of organizations we could be getting behind as a section or as a national organization to kind of support and further the work that's already being done, right? How can we better support these organizations, many of which are either founded by or they're currently being run by Black women? How can we better support the work that they're doing so that they can support the work we want to be doing in honor of our Black girls? Okay, I think that was it. Nope. Oh, got one more. We actually have a voice of a Black girl. I'm sorry. And so finally, with we wanted to close with the actual voice of a Black girl. I'll invite you to read it, but I'm going to introduce her. Mom, go ahead and read it after I share who Cameron is.
Oh, okay.
So Cameron Days, when she wrote this, she was a magical 15-year-old Black girl living in Atlanta. She's now a magical 17-year-old Black girl as of this week. And she is my cousin. I asked her to write from the perspective of herself. And I said, like, what would you want adults to promise you? If you could ask them for anything that would help further you as a student, as a Black girl, as a free child of play, what would you ask them? And this is what she gave me with no insider input from me. This is what she emailed back to me.
As of today, I pledge to play more to benefit myself and the generations who will follow me. I promise to do my best to ensure that not only children in my community play regularly, but I as well. I understand that playing is healthy and beneficial for the mind, body, and soul. I desire to be the embodiment of this pledge by taking the initiative to lead my community into a future of more playing and less stressing.
So that is a pledge from Cameron Days. We thank her, we lift up her voice. We wanted to conclude with the amazing voice of a Black girl. We thank you for attending our presentation. I really don't know what the time check looks like, so I'm not sure if we have time for Q&A. Can anyone confirm that? I know it's 5 o'clock, but I also know we started just a little late. I don't mind staying on for another few minutes, Mom, if you don't. Okay, so I'm open to taking questions if you all want to put them in the chat.
Or maybe signal or something. And I see Cheryl with a thumbs up. Does that mean you have a question or that? Oh, okay. Thanks for the thumbs up.
Thank you. And we appreciate all of the engagement in the chat. This is great. We really do. Oh, we have 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you all have a question, we're open to them. I can't promise you that I have an answer to it, but we are open to them.
I have a quick question. I have both a son and a daughter, and I understand you focused on girls, but how much of this overlaps for boys? Is it more of the same? Is it more acute for girls because we have to control girls more in the society? Or what do you think? What do you know on that?
Do you want to respond, Mom? Or
well, a lot of times y'all will find that our maybe because of age and life status that they're different, but there are a couple of reasons why we focus on the girls. Number one, of course, because this is a women organization, but if you're just paying attention to the news now and everything, the focus is on our men and our boys, and we as women, and the same circumstances happening to us has become invisible. And so yes, it may be happening statistically less to Black girls or to Black women, but in comparison to white girls and white children, exponentially higher. So that would be my answer. I have sons too. Ari's my only daughter, so that's my answer and my sense. But Ari, we always have something to add and tag team on each other.
yeah, I would say that I can't definitively say it's happening less, actually, Mom, considering that Black girls and women are the fastest increasing demographic of people entering prisons. I would say that it's documented less for Black girls than I would say it is happening less. I do think these statistics are overlapping in that if I think the rate was like for at one point, maybe it was middle school, Black girls are 5 times more likely than white girls to be suspended. I would say it's a similar number for boys. It's slightly higher, but a similar number. So I would say that they're overlapping and that the disparities are stark, but the experiences look differently. So if boys are being sent directly to prison, in many ways, like Monique Morris says, Black girls are being sent home with ankle monitors, or they're being sent to detention facilities, as opposed to actually being imprisoned inside like a penitentiary. So it looks different. They're still part of the same carceral system. But like I said, I do think there are many ways in which Black girls are not given the benefit of the doubt at all. Even like in popular culture, I could go on for days right now about like what's happening on Twitter with Black girls, and just thinking about how the response to Black boys is very different than the response to Black girls. Even the Say Her Name movement is being co-opted, right? Like that whole movement started because not enough people were talking about the ways in which Black women and girls are being murdered by police. And now people are saying, say his name, as though we weren't already chanting George Floyd's name and not Breonna Taylor's, right? So there are many instances in which Black men are being given a platform, well, not being given, but they're being put on this platform by Black women. And in the process, Black girls aren't being given equal space. I'm not saying that Black girls should only be on that platform or Black boys should only. I do think that there's space to lift up all of these names and these experiences, but because Black girls are already discredited, we could take it all the way back to the Moynihan Report. It could take it even further back to slavery, in which, you know, women were not respected for their bodies at all, right? And we just see this cycle playing out over and over again now at an even younger age.
Ari, I was going to add, and then someone else also mentioned this in the chat. I think it was Mariah Washington. Thank you for that. That also there's, in terms of programs and funding to work with our girls, there's more money being put towards working with our young men and boys. There's far less research even on these circumstances surrounding girls as opposed to to the boys. But thanks to people like Monique Morris, we're finding more information now. But so it's just, I just feel as a woman, and as an educator, that this is just important that we focus on our girls, not to exclude other people, but just this as a chosen focus.
I think your question is important. I think it's a both and.
Yeah,
that's just definitely me. I think it's a both and. And we chose to talk about Black girlhood because one, it's in CNW, but two, I don't think we have enough language for what's happening around Black girlhood, just period. We might be well versed in the school to prison pipeline, but what about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, right? And so it's a both and for me. Thank you, Ms. Cheryl, for your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And just, I love just the thoughts that are being sparked here.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us throughout this time.
Yes. Thank you so much, and peace to all of you.